When I found out my husband was texting his ex, it wasn't the message that broke me. It was how calm he was when I confronted him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back. Back to the quiet days before everything fell apart. For most of our marriage, I used to believe Ethan and I were the kind of couple people secretly envied. We weren't flashy or dramatic. We were simple, comfortable in our little routines. Every morning, he'd brew the coffee before I even got out of bed. The smell of roasted beans would drift down the hallway, and I'd follow it like a child chasing the scent of something safe. He'd greet me with a small smile and a sleepy, "Morning, sweetheart," while flipping through the newspaper he never really read. Our home wasn't perfect, but it was ours. The walls were painted in soft colors, warm beige, light gray, the kind of tones that felt like quiet companionship. We had a dog named Milo who always curled up near the window, watching for Ethan's car every evening. I worked part-time as a librarian at the community center. Ethan ran a small marketing firm he'd built from scratch. We were proud of that. We were proud of us. Even my mother-in-law, Margaret, used to tell people how lucky her son was. She'd say, "Clara keeps that boy grounded. Without her, Ethan would forget what real life looks like." And she wasn't wrong. Margaret was a strong woman, soft-spoken, elegant, and the kind of person who made tea feel like an act of love. She treated me like a daughter, not a daughter-in-law. When we visited her on Sundays, she'd always cook something special: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and the best apple pie you've ever tasted. Those were peaceful times, the kind that lull you into believing they'll last forever. But peace, I've learned, is a fragile thing. It doesn't shatter loudly. It cracks slowly, like glass under pressure, until one day you wake up and realize the life you trusted isn't what you thought it was.
It started subtly. Ethan's phone, once left casually on the table, was suddenly always in his pocket. His work hours stretched longer. "Client emergencies," he said, and when I'd ask which client, he'd mumble a name I'd never heard before. At first, I brushed it off. Every marriage has quiet spells, doesn't it? We were both busy, tired. Maybe this was just one of those phases where love hums in the background instead of singing loud. But there were moments, small, fleeting, when I'd feel something uneasy stir in me. Like one night when I walked into our bedroom and saw Ethan smiling down at his phone. His thumb moved across the screen, quick, deliberate. I asked what was funny. He jumped a little, then said, "Just a meme from Tom." But when I laughed and said, "Show me," his smile faltered. He slipped the phone into his pocket and kissed my forehead instead. "Nothing worth showing, sweetheart." I told myself not to overthink it. After all, Ethan had never given me a reason not to trust him. Then came the day that would change everything. It was a Sunday morning, one of those calm, golden ones where the house feels like it's wrapped in sunlight. I was folding laundry in the living room while Ethan showered upstairs. His phone buzzed on the couch beside me. Normally, I wouldn't touch it, but that morning, I did. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was something heavier, an ache that had been waiting to speak. The screen lit up, and there it was. The name I hadn't seen in years. Emily. The text said, "I miss the way you used to make me laugh. Do you ever think about us?" I froze. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears I didn't want to shed. Emily wasn't just some stranger. She was the ex, the one Ethan dated for years before me, the one he said broke his heart, the one he swore he'd never speak to again. My mind raced. Maybe it was old. Maybe she texted out of the blue and he hadn't replied. I tapped the message thread. My stomach dropped. It wasn't one message, it was months. Months of back and forth. Sweet words, inside jokes, late night, "I can't sleep without talking to you's," pictures, secrets. I remember the way the laundry fell from my hands, the way the hum of the washing machine suddenly felt like a cruel soundtrack to the end of my piece. When Ethan came downstairs, he looked the same.
towel around his shoulders, humming a tune, smelling of soap and aftershave. And I stood there, shaking, holding his phone like it was evidence of a crime I didn't want to believe had been committed. "Who is she to you now, Ethan?" That's all I managed to say. He froze. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. The only sound was Milo's soft whine from the corner. Then slowly, he looked at me, his expression calm, almost too calm, and said, "You weren't supposed to see that." Not, "I'm sorry," not, "It's not what you think," just that. That one line cracked something inside me that day. I wish I could say I screamed or threw things or demanded answers, but I didn't. I just stood there, listening to the quiet hum of betrayal filling the room. After a while, I placed his phone on the table and walked to the bedroom. I packed a small bag, just enough for a few days, and left. He didn't follow me. And as I drove away, I kept hearing his words echo in my head. "You weren't supposed to see that." As if the betrayal was fine, so long as it stayed hidden. That night, I stayed at my friend Mia's house. I didn't cry right away. I just sat on her couch, staring at the ceiling, feeling my life rearrange itself into something unrecognizable. It's strange how silence can hurt more than words, how absence can scream louder than anger. Because in that silence, I understood something I'd never wanted to learn. Sometimes the person who swore to protect your heart ends up being the one to shatter it.
That was the night my marriage began to die. But it wasn't the end of the story. Because what came after, the lies, the unraveling, the role my mother-in-law played, that was when everything truly caught fire. In the days after I left, the silence between us stretched like an open wound. No calls, no apologies, just absence. I kept expecting him to show up at my door, to beg, to explain, to try, but he didn't. And that hurt more than the messages themselves. Because when someone betrays you, you still hope they'll fight to make it right. Ethan didn't fight. He just disappeared into his guilt, leaving me to face the wreckage alone. Mia, my best friend, kept me busy. She'd bring me tea, scroll through old movies with me, even make me laugh now and then. But there was a heaviness that never left my chest. I'd wake up each morning and check my phone, half hoping, half dreading to see his name. Sometimes I'd catch myself remembering the small things, how Ethan used to rest his hand on the back of my neck when we crossed the street, how he'd hum while brushing his teeth, how he'd kiss my shoulder before leaving for work. It's cruel how memory works. It doesn't spare you just because someone's hurt you. It keeps replaying the good parts, as if pegging you to pretend the bad ones don't exist. About a week later, Margaret, my mother-in-law, called. Her voice was gentle, careful, like someone stepping across thin ice. "Clara, sweetheart," she said, "I heard you've been staying with Mia. Are you all right?" I tried to sound steady. "I'm fine, Margaret." There was a pause, then she sighed. That long, aching kind of sigh that mothers give when they already know the truth. "I don't know what Ethan's done, Clara, but I can tell you one thing. That boy has been walking around like a ghost. Won't eat, won't talk. He came by my house yesterday looking like he hadn't slept in days." I didn't respond. I didn't know how. She hesitated, then added softly, "I'm not excusing him, Clara. God knows I'm not. But if you ever want to talk, my door's open." That night, I lay awake thinking about her words. Ethan had looked like a ghost, she said. For some reason, that image hurt me. I didn't want him to be okay, but I didn't want him destroyed either. That's the strange thing about love. Even when it's bruised, it still flinches when the other person bleeds. Still, I couldn't forgive him. Not yet. 2 weeks passed, then 3. And one morning, I woke to a soft knock at Mia's apartment door. When I opened it, Ethan was standing there. He looked different, paler, thinner, eyes red-rimmed and tired. He was holding a paper bag.
He said, "I brought your things. You left some clothes behind." Mia was still asleep, so I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. We stood in the hallway, the smell of stale coffee drifting from somewhere down the corridor. He handed me the bag. His fingers brushed mine for a second, cold, trembling. "Clara," his voice cracked a little. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to tell you, it's over with Emily, completely. It was a mistake, all of it." I crossed my arms, staring at the floor. A mistake. Ethan, you made a choice, over and over again. He nodded, shame filling every line of his face. "You're right. I don't even know why I did it. I thought I missed her. But it wasn't her I missed. It was the version of myself I used to be." That line, "the version of myself I used to be," stayed with me, because it sounded like a confession, not an excuse. But I wasn't ready to give him comfort, not when the wound was still open. I said, "Please, Ethan, don't come here again, not until I'm ready to talk, if I ever am." He nodded, eyes glistening. "Okay." And just like that, he left, walking down that dim hallway like a man carrying his own shadow. Weeks turned into months. I went back to work at the library. The rhythm of shelving books, the quiet hum of pages turning, became a kind of therapy. Life was dull but peaceful, until one afternoon when Margaret appeared at my desk, clutching a small bouquet of lilies. "Margaret," I said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" She smiled faintly. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd stop by." We sat together in the small reading corner. For a few minutes, we talked about simple things. The weather, her garden, the new librarian who always wore mismatched socks. Then her voice softened. "Clara, I need to ask something. Have you heard from Ethan?" I shook my head. "Not since that day at Mia's." Her eyes welled up. "He's not doing well, dear. His business, it's falling apart. And that woman, Emily, she's gone. Took his money, drained his accounts, and disappeared." I blinked. "What?" Margaret nodded slowly. "He's been trying to pick up the pieces, but he's lost almost everything. The house, the clients, his confidence." There was no joy in her tone, no hint of he got what he deserved. Just sorrow. I sat in silence, processing her words. The man who once seemed untouchable was now crumbling, and part of me didn't know how to feel. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing Ethan sitting alone in our empty house, staring at the walls we once painted together. I wondered if he thought about me when he made coffee, or if he still listened to the same old playlist on Sunday mornings. I didn't want to miss him, but pain and love don't live in separate rooms. They share the same walls. And though I didn't realize it yet, Margaret's visit that day was the beginning of something unexpected, because she wasn't just checking in. She was preparing to intervene in a way that would change everything again. They say betrayal breaks trust, but sometimes it also breaks illusions, the ones that keep you from seeing the truth about yourself and the people you love. I thought the worst was behind me, but I was wrong, because soon Margaret would step into the middle of it all, and the fire that had been smoldering quietly between us would finally erupt. Some betrayals hit once, sharp and sudden. Others keep echoing, long after you think you've moved on. By the time winter came, I'd grown used to the silence between Ethan and me. It was strange how something that used to hurt so much could start to feel almost quiet, like a dull ache that's become part of your body. But then one evening, the silence broke. I was just closing the library when my phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. "Clara, I need to see you. It's about Ethan." Her words were simple, but something in them made my stomach twist. When I arrived at her house, she was already waiting by the door, wrapped in a wool shawl, her face pale and tired. "Come in, dear," she said softly. I made team. We sat in her small, cozy kitchen, the one that always smelled of cinnamon and old wood polish. But that night, the air felt heavier. She took a deep breath. I've been trying not to get involved. I told myself this was between you and him, but I can't stay silent anymore. I frowned. What do you mean? Margaret's eyes glistened. Ethan's in trouble, Clara. He won't admit it, but he's drowning. And it's all because of that woman, Emily. I stayed quiet, letting her speak. She came back into his life months ago. At first I thought it was innocent. They'd bumped into each other at some business event. But she knew exactly what she was doing. She played him, convinced him to invest in her so-called consulting venture. He trusted her, too much. And when he finally realized she'd used him, it was too late. The money was gone. She vanished. Margaret's voice trembled. He lost nearly everything, Clara. Even the house. He's been staying at my place since last month. He doesn't eat, doesn't talk, just sits there, looking out the window, like a man waiting for something that will never come back. I stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to say he deserved it, every bit of it. But the truth, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt sadness. Because this wasn't the man I'd fallen in love with, or even the man who betrayed me. This was someone hollowed out by his own choices.
Why are you telling me this? I asked quietly. Margaret reached across the table, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched my hand. Because I know you still care. You wouldn't be here otherwise. I'm not asking you to take him back, just to see him, once. Please. I looked down at her hand. Her warmth felt like something I hadn't felt in months, a human kindness untouched by betrayal. I didn't answer her that night, but her words followed me home, whispering at the edges of my thoughts. A few days later, I finally agreed. When I walked into Margaret's house, the air was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. And there he was, Ethan, sitting by the window, shoulders slumped, a cup of untouched coffee beside him. He looked up when he heard me. For a moment, he just stared. Then slowly, he stood. Clara, he breathed, as if saying my name hurt. I didn't know what to say. The sight of him, thinner, older somehow, stirred something complicated inside me. I didn't come here for a fight, I said softly. He nodded. I wouldn't blame you if you did. There was silence again. The kind that fills every space between two people who've said too much and too little all at once. Finally, he spoke. You were right. About everything. About her. About me. I watched him struggle with the words. His hands trembled slightly as he rubbed them together. She used me, Clara. Every word she said, every smile, it was all a lie. She drained the accounts, ruined my company's reputation, and disappeared. I thought I'd lost everything the day you walked out, but I didn't realize what everything really meant until now. He looked at me then, eyes red, filled with tears he wasn't trying to hide. I betrayed the only person who ever truly loved me, and I can't take it back. I can't fix it. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. There was nothing to say, no comfort that could undo what had been done. But still, I sat down, because for the first time, his regret felt real. Not desperate, not manipulative, just human. We sat in silence for a long while. The only sound was the creak of the old chair and the faint hum of the heater. Then I said, almost in a whisper, You know, Ethan, I used to think forgiveness was something you gave people because they deserved it. Now I realize it's something you give yourself when you're ready to stop bleeding. He looked at me, tears spilling down his cheeks. Are you ready? I shook my head. No, but I'm closer than I was. He nodded, understanding. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected began to happen. I didn't move back home, not yet, but Ethan started helping Margaret around the house, volunteering at the shelter where I sometimes dropped off books. He never pushed, never asked for anything. He just showed up, quietly, consistently. And little by little, I found myself speaking to him again, about simple things like the weather, Milo,
the books we used to read. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something gentler, like the slow mending of a fabric once torn. One evening, Margaret joined me in the garden behind her house. The sun was setting and she was pruning her roses, the same ones she'd planted the year Ethan and I got married. She handed me a pair of gloves and said, "You know, dear, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It just means you've decided to stop letting it define you." I looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, I smiled. "I think I'm starting to understand that." She nodded. "Good, because I've seen enough bitterness in my life to know it only poisons the one holding it." We worked in silence after that, the scent of roses mixing with the cool evening air. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the first fragile stirrings of peace. I thought the storm was over, but forgiveness, real forgiveness, is never a single moment. It's 1,000 quiet choices made in the aftermath of pain. And though Ethan's past had burned our world to ashes, I was beginning to see, maybe, just maybe, something new could grow from what was left behind. They say time heals all wounds, but I don't think that's true. Time doesn't heal, it simply teaches you how to live with the scars. Months passed after that evening in Margaret's garden. Winter melted into spring, and with it, something inside me began to thaw too. Ethan and I weren't together, not officially, but our lives started to intersect again in small, cautious ways. He'd drop by the library to return a book, sometimes bringing coffee from my favorite cafe. I never asked him to stay, but sometimes he'd linger, pretending to browse while we exchanged a few quiet words. I could tell he was trying, not through grand gestures, but through presence. And somehow that mattered more than apologies ever could.
Still, I hadn't forgiven him, not entirely, because every time I looked at him, I'd remember that message, "Do you ever think about us?" and the way he'd answered her. It wasn't just what he'd done, it was that for a while, I'd stopped existing in his world, even while sitting across from him at the dinner table. I wanted to believe people could change, but part of me wondered, was he sorry because he'd lost me, or because he'd lost everything else? It was Margaret who helped me see the difference. She'd visit me once a week, always bringing something homemade, banana bread, soup, sometimes just a pot of tea. And every time she'd talk about Ethan with a kind of motherly honesty that only she could pull off. "He's different now," she said one afternoon, pouring tea into my favorite cup. "Not because he wants to impress anyone, but because he's finally met himself. And trust me, Clara, that's a painful meeting." I smiled faintly. "You think he's changed?" She nodded slowly. "Pain has a way of humbling a man in ways comfort never could." Her words stayed with me. A few days later, I saw Ethan at the shelter. He was wearing an old flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, helping unload boxes of canned food from a van. I stood there for a moment, watching him laugh with one of the volunteers. Not a big, performative laugh, but a soft, real one. He caught my eye and smiled, hesitantly. I nodded back, then went inside. That evening, when I told Margaret what I'd seen, she smiled in that knowing way only mothers can. "Good," she said softly. "Let him keep doing good. Not for you, not even for forgiveness, just because it's right." Over time, Ethan began opening up, not in long, tearful confessions, he'd done enough of those, but in small truths, the kind that slip out when someone is finally ready to face themselves. He told me how Emily had reached out after years of silence, promising to help his business expand into new markets. How he ignored every red flag because he wanted to feel admired again. How she made him feel like the man he used to be, before the responsibilities, before the routines, before the quiet. "She made me feel seen," he said one day, eyes downcast. "And I didn't realize I'd been taking your kind of love for granted, the steady kind, the kind that doesn't shout but stays." His honesty hurt, but it also healed something small inside me. Because for the first time, he wasn't trying to justify the betrayal. He was trying to understand it. But rebuilding trust isn't just about apologies. It's about accountability.
So I told him plainly, Ethan, you can't rebuild your life expecting me to be the reward at the end of it. If you're doing all this for me, it won't last. You have to do it because you want to be a better man, even if I never come back. He nodded, tears glinting in his eyes. I know, and that's what I'm trying to do. Then came the day his company officially shut down. I found out through Margaret. Ethan hadn't told me. He was too proud, too ashamed. When I called to check on him, he tried to sound fine, but his voice cracked halfway through the conversation. Later that evening, I went to see him. He was sitting on the floor of his empty office, surrounded by boxes and paperwork, staring at a photograph of us from years ago, our first anniversary. He looked up as I entered, his face tired but calm. He said, I thought I'd feel angry at losing it all, but honestly, I just feel lighter. Like maybe this is the price I had to pay to start over. I sat beside him, the quiet between us heavy but not uncomfortable. I said, you know, sometimes life doesn't punish us because we're bad. It punishes us because we refuse to listen when it whispers. He looked at me then, a faint, broken smile tugging at his lips. He said, I should have listened to you, Clara. You were always the whisper I ignored. We sat there for a long while, two people surrounded by the ruins of what pride had built. After that day, something shifted, not just in him, but in me too. Forgiveness stopped feeling like surrender. It started feeling like freedom. I began to visit more often, not as his wife, but as someone who cared enough to see if he'd eaten, if he was okay. Each time, I'd notice something small. The way he'd fixed the window latch, repainted the walls, started a consultancy from scratch. He was trying, not to win me back, but to rebuild himself. One evening, I stayed for dinner at Margaret's. Ethan was there helping her set the table. It felt strangely normal. The clink of dishes, the smell of garlic and rosemary filling the kitchen. Halfway through the meal, Margaret looked at the two of us and said quietly, I prayed for this. Not for you to forget what happened, but for you to find peace in remembering. Her words made my throat tighten, because that was exactly what I was feeling. Not anger, not sadness, just peace. Ethan's downfall wasn't just losing money or reputation, it was being forced to face the man he'd become, and the cost of his own choices. But in losing everything, he found something far rarer: humility, patience, and a kind of love that asks for nothing in return. And as for me, I found something too. Strength, clarity, and a heart that finally stopped breaking long enough to start healing. But forgiveness is a journey, not a destination. And before ours could truly begin, one more chapter had to unfold. The night Margaret finally told me the truth about her own role in our story. A truth that would change the way I saw everything. It was a quiet Sunday evening when Margaret called. Her voice sounded different, softer, in a way I'd never heard before. Clara, she said, could you come by tonight? There's something I need to tell you before it's too late. My heart tightened. I didn't know what she meant, but I didn't hesitate. Within half an hour, I was standing on her porch, the porch I'd once walked up 100 times as her daughter-in-law, not as a guest. She opened the door before I could knock. Her eyes looked tired, rimmed with the kind of sorrow that comes from carrying too much for too long. Come in, sweetheart, she whispered. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. The same family photos hung on the wall. Ethan in his school uniform, our wedding picture, Margaret with her late husband, all frozen in happier times. We sat down with cups of chamomile tea, and for a while, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed, her voice trembling. I've been meaning to tell you this for a long time, but I didn't have the courage. I think part of me didn't want you to look at me differently. I frowned gently. Margaret, what do you mean? She looked down, wringing her hands like someone confessing a crime. "When you first married Ethan," she said slowly, "I was proud of him. He'd found a woman who loved him for who he was, not what he had. But when Emily came back into the picture, I didn't stop him." The words hit me like cold water. I stared at her, unsure if I'd heard right.
"You knew?" I whispered. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I did. I saw the messages before you did. He came to me, confused, saying he didn't know what to do, and instead of telling him to fight for his marriage, I told him maybe he needed to find closure." My breath caught. Closure, that word again, the same one he'd used when I confronted him. "Margaret, why?" She looked away, ashamed. "Because I thought if I gave him the freedom to make his own mistake, he'd come running back once he realized what he'd lost. I thought I could protect you both by staying quiet. But all I did was let him walk into a fire and let you burn in the smoke." Tears blurred my vision. For a moment, I didn't know whether to be angry or heartbroken, because somehow her confession hurt just as much as the betrayal itself. She reached for my hand, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Clara. I was wrong. I wanted to believe love could survive anything, even silence. But sometimes silence is the worst betrayal of all." The clock ticked softly between us. I could hear the rain outside, gentle, persistent, like the sky itself was listening. I looked at Margaret, really looked at her. The lines on her face, the sorrow in her eyes. This woman had been my family once, and in her way, she still was. And though her choices had hurt me, I could also see that she'd been living with that guilt ever since. So I took a deep breath and said quietly, "You were trying to protect your son, and maybe a part of you was trying to protect me too. But Margaret, you don't have to carry that burden anymore." She let out a broken laugh, tears spilling freely. "After everything, you still have that kind heart of yours. No wonder my son fell in love with you." I smiled faintly through my own tears. Maybe that's the problem. I loved him enough for both of us. She shook her head gently. "No, my dear, that was never the problem. The problem was he didn't love himself enough to be worthy of it." That night, before I left, she held my hands tight. "Promise me one thing," she whispered. "If you ever find a reason to forgive him, do it. Not for him, but for your own peace. Life's too short to let pain be your companion." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. When I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled fresh, washed clean, like something new was beginning. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and I continued to cross paths. Not in planned meetings or forced conversations, just in life's small coincidences. One morning, I found him sitting outside the shelter again, fixing a broken chair with a small toolkit. When he saw me, he smiled. Not a hopeful smile, not pleading, just quiet acknowledgement. "You're still doing this?" I asked, nodding toward the chair. He chuckled softly. "It's cheaper than therapy." We both laughed. It felt strange and yet easy. He looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "I know my words don't matter much, but I want you to know I'm not the same man I was. I don't expect anything from you. I just want you to know that I finally understand what I destroyed and what you deserved all along." I nodded slowly. "I know, Ethan. I can see it." And I meant it, because there was something different about him, a stillness that comes only from learning the hard way. Weeks turned into months. We started talking more, not about the past, but about small things. Books, work, the garden. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't romance. It was rebuilding, brick by fragile brick. Until one afternoon, while we were both at Margaret's, she smiled at us across the table and said, "You know, love doesn't always come back wearing the same face. Sometimes it returns as forgiveness."
I didn't answer. But that night, as I lay in bed, her words echoed in my mind. Forgiveness. Not for what he did, but for what I lost trying to hold on to it. A few months later, Ethan asked to meet me at the park. When I arrived, he was standing under the old oak tree where we used to sit when we were first married. He said, "I don't expect anything, but I just wanted to say thank you for letting me find my way back to being human again." I smiled, a small, honest smile. "You did that on your own, Ethan. I just stopped standing in the way." He looked at me then, eyes glistening with gratitude, and for the first time in years, I realized the anger in me was gone. Not because I'd forgotten, but because I'd finally learned to let go. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Forgiveness isn't a door you walk through once. It's a path you keep walking, even when the ground still hurts beneath your feet." Margaret's confession hadn't broken me. It had freed me. Because sometimes the truth doesn't ruin you, it releases you. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for the next chapter to begin. It's strange how life has a way of finding rhythm again after chaos. Months turned into years, and what once felt like an open wound became something else. A scar, tender, but no longer painful. Ethan and I never decided, let's start over. There was no dramatic reunion, no flowers or promises. It began with small things. A shared meal at Margaret's, a phone call about taxes, helping each other fix a leaky faucet. Ordinary things that slowly wove new trust, where old trust had burned away. At first, I was cautious. I kept a quiet distance, guarding my peace like a fragile candle. But time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. And little by little, I began to see not the man who broke me, but the man who was trying every day to be better.
I remember one evening in particular. We were at Margaret's again, celebrating her birthday. The house was warm, filled with laughter and the smell of her favorite lemon cake. As the candles flickered, I caught Ethan's eyes across the table. Steady, calm, no expectations. When Margaret made her wish and blew out the candles, she said, smiling through tears, "I wished for peace, and look, it's sitting right in front of me." Everyone laughed, but I knew what she meant. Peace, after years of hurt, guilt, and regret, is the rarest gift of all. Ethan walked me to my car that night. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain on pavement. He stood there, hands in his pockets, and said quietly, "Clara, I know I can never undo what I did, but if someday you can let me be part of your life again, even in the smallest way, I'll be grateful." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, there was no heaviness between us. Just two people who'd been through their storms and somehow found the shore again. "I think," I said softly, "maybe that day is already here." He smiled then, not the charming, confident smile I once fell for, but a humble, human one. And I realized I wasn't forgiving the man he was. I was forgiving the man he'd become. Over time, we started spending more days together, not because we were trying to fix something, but because it finally felt right to share life again. We went slowly, learning each other all over again, like strangers reintroduced by fate. And when we remarried, yes, remarried, it wasn't with grand gestures or a crowd of witnesses. It was just the two of us, standing beneath that same oak tree where he'd once apologized years before. Margaret held the rings, tears shining in her eyes. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better. A story about grace. Because love after betrayal isn't about pretending it never happened. It's about knowing it did and choosing to love anyway. A few years later, our home was filled with new sounds. The patter of little feet,
the laughter of our 2 children, and the quiet joy that comes from knowing how close you came to losing everything. Sometimes when I watch Ethan playing with them, I still think about the woman I used to be. The one who sat on the bathroom floor, phone in hand, heartbreaking in silence. And I wish I could reach back in time, hold her face in my hands, and whisper, "You'll survive this. You'll even smile again." Because she wouldn't have believed it then, but she'd be proud of where we are now.
Forgiveness didn't erase what happened. It simply loosened the hold pain had over me. It allowed me to stop asking why and start asking what now. And Margaret, she became my mother again in every way that mattered. She never stopped thanking me for my patience, my compassion, for not turning bitterness into armor. But I always told her the truth. I didn't forgive to save Ethan. I forgave to save myself. She would smile, her voice gentle as ever. That's the kind of strength most people spend a lifetime trying to find. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Ethan and I sat on the porch as the sun melted into the horizon. He reached over, took my hand, and said, "I still think about that day sometimes when everything fell apart. I thank God it happened." I turned to him, surprised. "You thank God for it?" He nodded. "Because it forced me to face who I really was, and it brought me back to who I should have been all along." I smiled softly, leaning against his shoulder. Then maybe it all happened the way it was supposed to. The sky deepened into violet, and crickets began their quiet chorus. And in that stillness, I realized peace doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sits beside you, holding your hand, whispering, "You made it." And that's the story of how my marriage broke, and how love, patient, flawed, and human, found its way back. It taught me this: people can lose their way, but if they truly change, if they truly understand the pain they've caused, and make it right not with words, but with actions, sometimes they deserve a second chance. Because forgiveness isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's choosing peace over poison. So if you're listening to this and your heart's been broken, I want you to remember something. You don't need to rush your healing. You don't have to forgive today or even tomorrow. But when the time comes and you find that the anger has nothing left to feed on, let it go. Not for them, but for you. Because sometimes life punishes those who hurt us all on its own. But forgiveness? That's the gift we give ourselves when the pain is finally over. Would you have forgiven him if you were in my place? Tell me in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because every story deserves to be heard.